The first sample that you're going to make in your book is what's called a plain seam. A seam is how we hold two pieces of fabric together. So like if you look at your jeans that you wear or your t-shirt, if you look down the side where the two pieces of fabric join together, that's a seam. So here I have two samples of the 4x9 fabric. These are my right sides. To make a seam, you're going to put the right sides together. So I'm going to line up these two pieces of fabric. I want to line up the edge. And I'm going to put a couple pins in it so that nothing moves on me. Pins do not go in the direction, like we're going to be drawing or sewing a seam here. I am not going to be putting my pins in this direction because what can happen is you're sewing, it's coming towards you, and you catch your hand on the pin. If you forget to take the pin out before you get to the presser foot, you're going to jam the machine up. So technically what we want to do is we want to put our pins going in the opposite direction. Now a small piece of fabric like this, you sometimes don't have to pin it. But I think it's going to be a good habit to get into pinning because when you start making a shirt or something else, you really have to pin your pieces together. So here I've got a couple pins. And I'm going to show you how to sew this. So this is what's called a plain seam. We're not doing anything fancy. We're just sewing two pieces of fabric together. So I'm going to put my fabric just under my presser foot. I'm going to make sure my tails of thread are hanging out the back. Some sewing machines, when you start to sew, will ball the thread up underneath and you have to hang on to the thread. If you get a bunch of thread underneath the seam on the back, we call that a bird's nest. And it's not a good thing because the threads can get caught in the machine. So I'm going to put my fabric right up just under the presser foot where I'm going to start to sew. Some people like to drop the needle by hand, and then you know that you've got everything secure. And I'm hanging on. This is not my sewing machine. I'm in someone else's studio, and I don't want to, ball up a bunch of thread inside her machine. And whenever you sew a seam that's permanent, which means you're never going to take it out of the garment, it's there to hold the garment together, we want to do what's called back tacking at the beginning and the end of a seam. If we don't back tack, what can happen is when you pull your fabric, you can actually pull that seam open accidentally. Like if I'm going to add something to this particular seam and I've pressed it open, I pull it, see how it starts to come undone? It's not secure. That's okay if we're putting something in there that's temporary, like we're basting something just to hold it long enough to get to our next step and we're going to take it out later. It makes it easier to take it out. So here on this machine, there's a little lever or a little button. Some have a lever over here in this area. Some have one on the front. You'll have to look at your sewing machine manual and figure out where yours is. So we're going to go forward a couple stitches, and I'm going to put this in a slower speed so it doesn't go too fast, so that you can actually see what I'm demonstrating here. So I'm going to go forward a couple of stitches. So there I've got about 3. And then I'm going to back up 1, 2, 3, and then go forward and sew my seam, and then I'll do the back tacking at the other end. I'm coming up to this pin, so I want to take it out. I don't want it in my way. You can sew over pins, but sometimes the needle will hit it and it'll bend the pin and damage your fabric, or you might break your needle. So going forward, I'm going to sew that seam. Now I find the placement of your hands and how you handle the fabric to be extremely important. You don't want to push the fabric because it will gather. You don't want to pull it from the back because you'll make your stitches longer. When you get to be doing curves, you're going to be holding that fabric and trying to curve it. So where you place your hands is going to be pretty important. I like to hold my fabric here and then one down here, guiding that fabric, because if you just let the machine take the fabric, it's going to take it anywhere it wants, and you're trying to control that seam allowance. So one hand here, one hand in the front. No pushing, no pulling, just let it happen. Let the machine do the sewing. Stop and take out pins as you go along. If this seam gets skewed off, you want to straighten it. I'm making sure everything for this is nice and straight and flat. And sew all the way to the end of the fabric. And then when I get to the end, I'm going to back up a little bit and back tack it. And that just makes the sample or your seam much more secure. So I'm going to be watching for you guys to do the back tacking. I'm going to clip all my threads off because I want this to be nice and neat and tidy. And then we're going to go to the ironing board and we're going to press it open. So this could be the side seam down a shirt or a skirt. And on this side, we're going to actually want to take the iron and we want to press this open. I like to finger press it first. You want to be careful that you don't wind up when you press it getting something that looks like this. You got a little flap because you didn't get it pressed open all the way. So I'm going to show you some ironing techniques. So here we're at the ironing board and we're going to press our fabric. You want a really good steam iron for sewing. Professional irons are really nice, but I think they're a little advanced at this point. You want to stick with like a household type iron. Most irons have a reservoir that you can pour water down in. Don't put it under the tap, but get a cup and pour it in, and I would have it unplugged when you do that. This is a steam iron, and you can see there's a little lever that lets me have more or less steam. And then most irons have a dial, and it will be marked with, like this one says silk, cotton, and then the maximum for jeans. You always want to test fabric to make sure that it's not going to burn or melt. Sometimes some polyester fabrics or acetate fabrics have to be pressed at a really low temperature or you'll melt the fabric. This is cotton, so we can have it up at a pretty high heat. Right now, this one is set for jeans. I'm just going to roll it down to cotton. It doesn't need to be quite that hot. New irons today have what's called an automatic shut-off. So if I walk away from this iron, it's going to shut itself off and not create a problem for us. An older iron, you got to be careful to remember to shut it off. So in the process of coming over here, I've wrinkled my sample. It looks terrible. And I'm going to lay it down. So I'm putting right side down. I'm going to press the seam open. I want to make sure that, you know, I tug a little bit on each side, make sure that I don't have it rolling underneath. And then I'm going to hold it down and I'm going to place my iron on it. And I'm just going to press that seam open. Pressing, as you go forward and you learn more technical aspects of things, ironing is when you're doing this. You don't want to do that because you're going to stretch your fabric. You want to press. So I'm putting it down, I'm pressing it. I can slide it, but I'm not putting a lot of pressure on it. Then I want to turn it over and I'm going to check the other side because a lot of times I see students make a sample and it winds up looking like this. Let me show you. On the other side, there's like a fold. We don't want that fold in the fabric. We want that to be pressed out. So then I would flip it to the other side. I'm going to smooth that out and I'm going to make sure that I press that wrinkle out. So here, because this is cotton and I really want it to be crisp, I can hit my steam button and I'll get a burst of steam. Oops, there's not enough water in here for now. I'll have to re-add it. Some irons have a thing that you press and it squirts water. And you know that here I'm putting water on this. When I do some quilting, I use water to get my seams really nice and flat. But again, this is another time when you really want to test that fabric to see if it can withstand having water on it, or are you going to get a stain or a watermark. So this is pressed really nice. Pressing is going to be important because if I was going to be attaching, if this was a skirt and I'm attaching the bodice to it, like right here, if this isn't pressed open and flat, it's going to look really bad when I join the next piece, and you cannot press it afterwards and get it flat. So when we start working on garments, I'm going to be a real stickler about you have to press as you go. I've seen people that want to make the whole garment and then they press it. And what can happen is if I don't have this pressed open and I just sew, if my seam is flipped down like this, then it's going to pull. So you're looking to make sure that everything is as crisp and as nice as it can be before you move to the next step. So you can see that this particular sample is just a plain seam. The fabric is raw at the edge. This is okay when you're making garments that are going to be lined, but when you're making garments, especially that you're going to be washing a lot, what can happen over time is you'll start to see the seam will do this and you'll have threads hanging off of it and unravels. So we're going to be talking about some other seams and seam finishes. I always suggest to new students that start looking at the clothing that you have in your closet. Look inside. Don't just look at what it looks like when you put it on, but look at how it's made. Look at the inside. Look for the finishes, because I think those are really important. And I always tell myself when I'm making something that's for me or it's for a family member, they deserve to have it be the nicest thing possible, because they can go buy some junk at Target and Walmart, or if they're getting something custom made by me, I want it to be as nice on the inside as it is on the outside. So that's just a piece of my personal opinion. You're putting your time and effort and money into making something that probably costs more than what you could buy it for. So it should actually be a better quality. So let's move on to the next sample. You want to mark the seam that it's a plain seam. So again, if you do it in marker, or if you want to type a label and attach a label, I don't care how you do it. I just need to know that you know that this was your plain seam. Many times students will do their sample book and they mark the samples after they've done them all, and there'll be 2 or 3 of them that are marked incorrectly, and that's not going to help you later on. So this is a plain seam.